Hi, I'm Matt Romoser with the Iowa Pork Industry Center, and today I want to talk to you about gilt structure and selection, really an important part of gilt development when we think about all of the extra work we do in developing these gilts. If we don't know how to select the right animal to be able to enter the herd, it really compromises our efforts up to this point. So I want to talk about what a sound and functional animal looks like and what we need to be selecting for from a structure standpoint. So the importance of gilt selection, when we think about it, the quality of the gilt, obviously, that we select today will impact the productivity of the farm in the future. And I think a lot of times when we talk about this in the industry, we're thinking much further, further out than what really reality is. If we're selecting the gilt today, chances are we're breeding her in a matter of a few weeks or months. And then in probably about 4 to 6 months after that, she's going to, obviously have farrow to litter by then. So really, the gilt we're selecting today has a fairly immediate impact as far as the type of productivity our farm can have. And with that, lameness is a primary cause for herd removal. Reproductive failure and lameness are really the primary causes or primary reasons for culling in the swine industry. And then work done here at Iowa State with a part of the survivability grant. It's also shown that lameness is really the one of the leaders in sow mortality on farms as well, second to only unknown deaths. So aside from sows that we find dead or mortalities we find in the farm, lameness is really the number one known cause of what we deal with regards to sow death loss. So really heightens the importance of being able to select and identify sound functional animals before they enter the herd. Particularly when we think about the industry and how it's transitioned really from stall housing to group housing, I think we recognize that we need a more comfortable, more athletic animal, but I don't know necessarily that our selection pressure has changed. We still obviously select on the same criteria we would have done 20 to 30 years ago as far as being able to have gilts that are durable in their build, but ultimately, I don't know if we've, as an industry, have adjusted and been more critical about the type of animal that we need to be able to select to endure, obviously, large group settings, whether it be in groups of 30 or groups of 200 sows. Those gilts are going to be, or those females are going to be a lot more stress and a lot more demand on their skeleton daily to be able to survive in that type of environment. So being able to select a more athletic female, I think, is very important, something that we as an industry, I think, can improve on. Think about proper training for selectors. Obviously, this is a skill that's very subjective, and be able to properly train on-farm personnel is paramount from both a consistency standpoint and make sure we're getting quality gilts put in, and be able to control over what animals enter the breeding herd. So it's very important to be able to have those people on the farm in charge of selecting be properly trained, and even maybe doing reviewing throughout different times of the year can certainly help reinforce a lot of those same fundamentals that we'll talk about here. So we talk about the selection process. Obviously, there's going to be some priorities that we want to be able to go over. First and foremost, obviously, those gilts need to be reproductively fit. And there's obviously lots of other slide sets we've talked about in this series that heighten the importance of reproduction and the fallout rate that we can have with reproductive failure. So I'd encourage you to go back and find those videos as well. But big picture, we want gilts that are adequate in their vulval size, as well as having an adequate underlying number of functional teats for that sow, for that gilt before she enters the breeding herd. Typically, the industry is going to look for a minimum of 14 functional teats, evenly spaced. Want to be able to avoid any mouth abnormalities on the underline, such as pin nipples, uneven spacing, really short, coarser teats are going to be harder for a piglet to latch onto. So really, 14 well-defined, functional, evenly spaced teats is going to be ideal from an underline standpoint. Obviously, we want to be able to, as we've already alluded to, select ones that are structurally correct. And then the third priority would be finding ones that have an adequate dimension and width. So obviously, we don't want to be finding or selecting gilts that are going to be a little bit more difficult fleshing, harder to keep body condition on. Ones that aren't going to be as maybe apt to get up and eat when they're in lactation, to be able to keep body condition on going through lactation. So having ones that have enough adequate width and dimension is going to be important from a selection process. Other things we need to consider is obviously we need to have growth rate. These eventual females are going to be parent stock to commercial market hogs, so we need to be able to have ones that can both supply, contribute sufficient growth rate to commercial market hogs. And ultimately, we want to be able to avoid gilts that are drastically undersized for their age. So again, we want to be able to target a lifetime average daily gain here of about 1.3 to 1.7 or 1.8. So really trying to avoid those gilts that are really far behind from a weight or average daily gain standpoint. It's important to have a set process and standards at the time of selection. So make sure, again, we've got consistency amongst the people doing the selecting, if it's one person or a team of people, and having set criteria that everyone can agree upon at the time of selection. And ultimately, we want to make sure we've got our facility set up where we have ample space for evaluation and selection. A lot of times when we get these gilts, even if we're providing them with a recommended 12 square feet at that mature size, it can be kind of tough to really get a good evaluation of these gilts, especially if they're in larger groups. It can be challenging to really evaluate these animals. So if you've got an empty pen or you've got extra space, maybe you'll be able to work through them and get them a little bit easier view from your selector standpoint can help ultimately make it easier from identifying those ideal females. So we talk about evaluating structure and what we need to be looking for and able to maximize sow lifetime productivity. So what's desirable? When we look at the front leg from the side, we want to be able to find ones that have adequate flexibility at that pastern and knee to be able to support that sow at a later mature weight. So we think about having a little bit extra cushion, a little bit extra flex there, similar to an athlete. Obviously, an athlete has to be able to bend and flex at all of their joints, their knees, their hips. Similar in that sense, we need to be able to have some flexibility and some shock absorption within the pastern and knee on a front leg here and a sow here. So we show the picture here off to the left. We want to be able to have sort of a backward curvature to that knee through that down through that pastern, right? So we've got that those parts labeled there. And really, this may be easiest to evaluate when you have this gilt in motion. So oftentimes, if a gilt's too straight-fronted or too buck-kneed, if you will, that gilt will take a much shorter, choppier stride out of her front legs. Oftentimes, you may see her spine sort of roach up and get a little bit more tight and rigid. That's because she's uncomfortable on the move. So being able to identify those on the move may make it easier from an evaluation standpoint. We've got our examples here off to the right where we talk about a soft pastern one. And you can see in the picture one that's just got a little bit more set to that front foot. And that dew claw is just a little bit closer to the ground. We would term this acceptable as certainly within practical sense and commercial sense. These animals certainly have pose a little bit more risk to damaging or injuring that dew claw or having sort of lesions on that rear part of the foot. But in general, these animals still stand a better chance to live longer, more productive lives than say just the opposite, where we look at the animal on the right, where we would term this buck-kneed or really straight through that knee. As you can see, all of the weight-bearing part of that gilt's front skeleton is going to be really going to be focused on that knee and down through that pastern, and that's a lot of weight to bear on those joints. There's really no give or flexibility through that part of the skeleton, and ultimately, that gilt is going to be a lot more predisposed to injury. In a group type setting, we would expect. And then obviously in the middle here, we've got an example of what we would term ideal. So we've got, again, a gilt that's got good backward curvature to that knee. It yet still has good strength to that pastern. That dew claw appears to be up and off of the ground, doesn't necessarily come in contact with any concrete or could potentially injure herself that way. We evaluate then, again, same way from the side, we're going to evaluate the rear leg. So again, what's going to be desirable? Very similar. We're going to want flex at that hock joint, and then also is down at the pastern as well to be able to allow for comfort and ease of movement. Again, when we evaluate this gilt in motion, she should have very coordinated step and not stride too excessively far forward or with a sickle hock orientation. So if a gilt really pulls her feet further up underneath her, typically a gilt like that is going to be more apt to what we would term dog sit or spraddle leg in the farrowing house or even out in pen gestation. It's going to be less comfortable for her to be able to get up and move, and it's going to be more challenge for her to be able to get up and move with a leg orientation that's a little bit further underneath her. So then we talk about what's ideal and what's maybe some call candidates here. So we look on the left here of what's normal. We can see a gilt who's got good flexion there to her hock and pastern, and yet that foot is placed directly underneath that pelvic bone. So all that weight is going to be dispersed fairly evenly. We look on the far right then of one we would say would be acceptable. Again, good flexion to those joints, maybe a little bit softer down there through that pastern. So obviously we've got a little bit more give there. And again, as we talked on the previous slide, one who's maybe a little bit more predisposed to injury just because that dew claw could get caught on flooring and what have you. But even still, those type of animals generally are going to last longer in production just because they've got that extra cushion and flex to those joints. We look at a couple of the cull candidates shown here in the middle. Again, as we've talked about, sickle-hocked animals, ones that carry their legs just a little bit further underneath them. Those ones are going to, again, make it more challenging to get up and down for that sow, and also maybe predisposed to a few more just joint lesions, as you can see there, the calluses on that one's hock. And then a very clear and easy to define one would be what we'd term post-legged or straight-legged, and you can see the gilt there, very, very rigid, very linear in the way that gilt's rear leg is positioned. Certainly, again, an animal you want to avoid, just because all of the weight and all of the pressure is really focused on about two joints there. So that gilt there is going to be much more susceptible to lameness and probably get culled from the herd much earlier in life than the other candidates. So we move from the side, we evaluate these gilts then from the front. Ultimately, we want those front feet to meet the ground evenly and point straight ahead. That way those toes can wear evenly. If we get gilts that we term splay-footed or pigeon-toed, is going to be just a difference in direction of which those toes are going to point. Ultimately, can result in uneven wear of the toes in those animals and make them more susceptible to lameness or hoof lesions. So we want to be able to make sure that those hooves and those toes wear on the concrete evenly and don't predispose them to any sort of lameness that way. So then we move in and we evaluate these gilts from behind. It's going to be very similar to what we just described from the front skeleton, where we want those rear feet to point straight ahead and then be aligned with the hip and the hock being directly below them. So making sure those feet and everything stays aligned with the rest of the skeleton. A cow-hocked animal will be one that turns their hocks inward and can create an unstable gait. So obviously if one's maybe close and narrow at their hock from behind, they typically will shuffle a little bit and maybe even pull their leg up underneath them just to be able to take an adequate step. Oftentimes you may see an animal like this that may be sickle-hocked. And again, as we talked, a lot of times those types of animals will dog sit and maybe not always get up or struggle to get up compared to a normal female in production. Just the opposite then, if we talk an animal that's bow-legged or pushes its hock outside of its skeleton, those ones will also take an uneven, uncoordinated gait, and then will wear uneven on those toes as we're putting different pressure on different toes when we talk about that structure from behind. Also from this viewpoint, I would say, particularly when we're looking at gilts when they're in the early part of that growing phase, I think it's important to be able to evaluate joints for swelling. Now, this would be different than just calluses on hocks, but particularly through that developmental period, we want to make sure we're paying attention to anything pathological that could be going on, whether it be some sort of a strep suis or anything that's going to result in some inflammation in that joint, maybe some mycoplasma, anything that can really damage the integrity of that joint. We want to be able to evaluate that swelling of that hock, and if there's anything that we need to be able to be treating to be able to make sure that gilt's going to develop properly from a skeletal standpoint. From there, obviously, then we talk about evaluating foot size and shape. I think this is one of the traits that I think a lot of producers can easily identify with, and I think it's a valuable one because it's very telling about how that gilt distributes her weight and how she can move and carry her weight, through obviously a rigorous environment living on concrete. So we want to be able to have ideal foot size and shape. We want to be able to have large toes, even in length, but also spread wide. Ultimately, when we think about foot size, a larger foot is going to be better for weight distribution. That sow's going to be able to spread her weight as she continues to grow and put on weight as a mature sow, can more evenly distribute that weight over a bigger foot. And it's going to be more relaxing on those joints, ultimately limit the amount of damage we're going to be doing to the joint just because she can spread it out over a larger surface. We look at abnormalities then here on the right. Again, a small narrow toe here. You can see that this gilt obviously is very straight through that hock and pastern and then meets the surface on a very narrow and small foot. So she's putting a lot of weight really on a very small surface area. And again, just compounding that added pressure that we're putting on those joints immediately above the foot. And then we look on the far right where we've got a gilt with uneven toes. So it's clearly this gilt's not wearing her toes evenly, and ultimately this could result in some inflammation and some damage we're doing to the joints. But more importantly, just predisposes this gilt to damage from a foot lesion standpoint, lameness, anything of the sort. So culling animals like this is certainly a priority, and these are all traits that I think are relatively easy for producers to be able to identify. So in summary, again, we want to make it clear that gilt selection is obviously a critical piece to setting up a farm for future success. And I know a lot of this information, a lot of producers are very much aware of it, but I think it's just important to be able to reinforce a lot of these these basic selection criteria, particularly as we've always got people that are maybe coming onto farms or maybe less familiar about what an ideal animal really needs to look like. We think about sow mortality and the general industry trend that we've seen over the last 10 years, and the fact that lameness still continues to be a major contributing factor, I think only underscores the fact and the importance that we need to do a better job of really selecting and identifying those ideal animals to enter the herd. And then, as I said, continual training is needed on farms to be able to keep consistency going. Those people who are in charge of selecting really do carry a lot of weight and an important responsibility. And even on, especially when we think about farms, even with farms with a higher employee turnover, very important to be able to keep the training consistent and be able to make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as what the ideal gilt is that needs to be entering a facility. So with that, I'm Matt Romoser with Iowa State University. Thank you for your time.